Henry George was an American political economist, journalist, and philosopher. George is famous for popularizing the idea that land, resource rents be captured for public use or shared, in lieu of harmful taxes on labor and productive investment. The philosophy and reform movement were known in George's time as single tax. His immensely popular writing is credited with sparking several reform movements of the progressive era and ultimately inspiring the broad economic philosophy that is today often referred to as Georgism, the main tenet of which is that people legitimately own value they fairly create, but that natural resources and common opportunities, most importantly the value of land or location, are rightfully owned in common by individuals in a community, rather than title holders. His most famous work, Progress and Poverty, sold millions of copies worldwide, probably more than any other American book before that time. The treatise investigates the paradox of increasing inequality and poverty amid economic and technological progress, the cyclic nature of industrialized economies, and the use of extensive land value tax as a remedy for these and other social problems. Biography. Life and career. George was born in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to a lower-middle-class family, the second of 10 children of Richard S. H. George and Catherine Pratt George. His father was a publisher of religious texts and a devout Episcopalian, and sent George to the Episcopal Academy in Philadelphia. George chafed at his religious upbringing and left the academy without graduating. Instead, he convinced his father to hire a tutor and supplemented this with avid reading and attending lectures at the Franklin Institute. His formal education ended at age 14 and he went to sea as a foremast boy at age 15 in April 1855 on the Hindu, bound for Melbourne and Calcutta. In California, George fell in love with Annie Corsina Fox, an 18-year-old girl from Sydney who had been orphaned and was living with an uncle. The uncle, a prosperous, strong-minded man, was opposed to his niece's impoverished suitor, but the couple, defying him, eloped and married in late 1861, with Henry dressed in a borrowed suit and Annie bringing only a packet of books. The marriage was a happy one and 4 children were born to them. Fox's mother was Irish Catholic, and while George remained an evangelical Protestant, the children were raised Catholic. On November 3, 1862, Annie gave birth to future United States Representative from New York, Henry George, Jr. Early on, even with the birth of future sculptor, Richard F. George, the family was near starvation. After deciding against gold mining in British Columbia, George was hired as a printer for the newly created San Francisco Times, and was able to immediately submit editorials for publication, including the popular What the Railroads Will Bring Us, which remained required reading in California schools for decades. George climbed the ranks of the Times, eventually becoming managing editor in the summer of 1867. George worked for several papers, including 4 years as editor of his own newspaper, San Francisco Daily Evening Post, and Time running The Reporter, a Democratic anti-monopoly publication. The George family struggled, but George's increasing reputation and involvement in the newspaper industry lifted him from poverty. George's other 2 children were both daughters. The first was Jenny George, later to become Jenny George Atkinson. George's other daughter was Anna Angela George, who would become mother of both future dancer and choreographer Agnes DeMille and future actress Peggy George. Economic and political philosophy. George began as a Lincoln Republican, but then became a Democrat. He was a strong critic of railroad and mining interests, corrupt politicians, land speculators, and labor contractors. He first articulated his views in an 1868 article entitled What the Railroad Will Bring Us. George argued that the boom in railroad construction would benefit only the lucky few who owned interests in the railroads and other related enterprises, while throwing the greater part of the population into abject poverty. This had led to him earning the enmity of the Central Pacific Railroad's executives. who helped defeat his bid for election to the California State Assembly. One day in 1871, George went for a horseback ride and stopped to rest while overlooking San Francisco Bay. He later wrote of the revelation that he had. "I asked a passing teamster, for want of something better to say, what land was worth there. He pointed to some cows grazing so far off that they looked like mice, and said, 'I don't know exactly, but there is a man over there who will sell some land for $1,000 an acre.' Like a flash it came over me that there was the reason of advancing poverty with advancing wealth. With the growth of population, land grows in value, and the men who work it must pay more for the privilege." Furthermore, on a visit to New York City, he was struck by the apparent paradox that the poor in that long-established city were much worse off than the poor in less developed California. These observations supplied the theme and title for his 1879 book Progress and Poverty, which was a great success, selling over 3 million copies. In it, George made the argument that a sizable portion of the wealth created by social and technological advances in a free market economy is possessed by landowners and monopolists via economic rents, and that this concentration of unearned wealth is the main cause of poverty. George considered it a great injustice that private profit was being earned from restricting access to natural resources while productive activity was burdened with heavy taxes, and indicated that such a system was equivalent to slavery, a concept somewhat similar to wage slavery. This is also the work in which he made the case for a land value tax in which governments would tax the value of the land itself, thus preventing private interests from profiting upon its mere possession, but allowing the value of all improvements made to that land to remain with investors. George was in a position to discover this pattern, having experienced poverty himself, knowing many different societies from his travels, and living in California at a time of rapid growth. In particular, he had noticed that the construction of railroads in California was increasing land values and rents as fast as or faster than wages were rising. In 1880, now a popular writer and speaker, George moved to New York City, becoming closely allied with the Irish nationalist community despite being of English ancestry. From there he made several speaking journeys abroad to places such as Ireland and Scotland where access to land was a major political issue. In 1886, George campaigned for mayor of New York City as the candidate of the United Labor Party, the short-lived political society of the Central Labor Union. He polled second, more than the Republican candidate Theodore Roosevelt. The election was won by Tammany Hall candidate Abraham Stevens Hewitt by what many of George's supporters believed was fraud. In the 1887 New York state elections, George came in a distant third in the election for Secretary of State of New York. The United Labor Party was soon weakened by internal divisions. The management was essentially Georgist, but as a party of organized labor it also included some Marxist members who did not want to distinguish between land and capital. Many Catholic members who were discouraged by the excommunication of Father Edward McGlynn, and many who disagreed with George's free trade policy. George had particular trouble with Terence V. Powderly, president of the Knights of Labor, a key member of the United Labor Coalition. While initially friendly with Powderly, George vigorously opposed the tariff policies which Powderly and many other labor leaders thought vital to the protection of American workers. George's strident criticism of the tariff set to him against Powderly and others in the labor movement. Death and funeral. George's first stroke occurred in 1890. After a global speaking tour concerning land rights and the relationship between rent and poverty, this stroke greatly weakened him, and he never truly recovered. Despite this, George tried to remain active in politics. Against the advice of his doctors, George campaigned for New York City mayor again in 1897, this time as an independent Democrat. The strain of the campaign precipitated a second stroke, leading to his death 4 days before the election. An estimated 100,000 people visited Grand Central Palace during the day to see Henry George's face, with countless more crowding outside, unable to enter, and held back by police. After the palace doors closed, the Reverend Lyman Abbott, Father Edward McGlynn, Rabbi Gustav Gottiel, Heber Newton, and John Sherwin Crosby delivered addresses. Separate memorial services were held elsewhere. In Chicago, 5,000 people waited in line to hear memorial addresses by the former governor of Illinois, John Peter Altgeld, and John Lancaster Spalding. The New York Times reported that later in the evening, an organized funeral procession of about 2,000 people left from the Grand Central Palace and made its way through Manhattan to the Brooklyn Bridge. This procession was all the way thronged on either side by crowds of silent watchers. The procession then went on to Brooklyn, where the crowd at Brooklyn City Hall was the densest ever seen there. There were thousands on thousands at City Hall who were so far back that they could not see the funeral procession pass. It was impossible to move on any of the nearby streets. The Times wrote, "Rarely has such an enormous crowd turned out in Brooklyn on any occasion, but that nonetheless, slow tolling of the City Hall bell and the regular beating of drums were the only sounds that broke the stillness. Anything more impressive could not be imagined." At Court Street, the casket was transferred to a hearse and taken to a private funeral at Fort Hamilton. Commentators disagreed on whether it was the largest funeral in New York history or the largest since the death of Abraham Lincoln. The New York Times reported, "Not even Lincoln had a more glorious death." The grave of Henry George, Greenwood Cemetery. Policy proposals. Tax on the value of land and natural resource titles. Henry George is best known for his argument that the economic rent of land should be shared by society rather than being owned privately. The clearest statement of this view is found in Progress and Poverty. We must make land common property. By taxing land values, society could recapture the value of its common inheritance and eliminate the need for taxes on productive activity. George believed that this would provide disincentives toward land speculation, but would continue to incentivize development, as landlords would not suffer tax penalties for any industry or edifice constructed on their land. Broadly applying this principle is now commonly known as Georgism. Many environmentalists, such as Bolton Hall and Ralph Borsodi, have agreed with the idea of Earth as the common property of humanity. The U.S. Green Party platform has endorsed the idea of ecological tax reform, including land value taxation and substantial taxes or fees on pollution as a replacement for command and control regulation. Municipalization of utilities and free public transit. George considered businesses relying on exclusive right-of-way land privilege to be natural monopolies. Examples of these services included the transportation of utilities, information, goods, and travelers. George advocated that these systems of transport along public ways should usually be managed as public utilities and provided for free or at marginal cost. In some cases, it might be possible to allow competition between private service providers along public rights-of-way, such as parcel shipping companies that operate on public roads, but wherever competition would be impossible, George supported complete municipalization. George said that these services would be provided for free because investments in beneficial public goods always tend to increase land values by more than the total cost of those investments. George used the example of urban buildings that provide free vertical transit, paid out of some of the increased value that residents derive from the addition of elevators. Intellectual property reform. George was opposed to or suspicious of all intellectual property privilege, because his classical definition of land included all natural forces and opportunities. Therefore, George proposed to abolish or greatly limit intellectual property privilege. In George's view, owning a monopoly over specific arrangements and interactions of materials, governed by the forces of nature, allowed title holders to extract royalty rents from producers, in a way similar to owners of ordinary land titles. George later supported limited copyright, on the ground that temporary property over a unique arrangement of words or colors did not in any way prevent others from laboring to make other works of art. George apparently ranked patent rents as a less significant form of monopoly than the owners of land title deeds, partly because he viewed the owners of locations as the robber that takes all that is left. People could choose not to buy a specific new product, but they cannot choose to lack a place upon which to stand. So benefits gained for labor through lesser reforms would tend to eventually be captured by owners and finances of location monopoly. Free trade. George was opposed to tariffs, which were, at the time, both a major method of protectionist trade policy and an important source of federal revenue. He believed that tariffs kept prices high for consumers, while failing to produce any increase in wages. He also thought that tariffs protected monopolistic companies from competition, thus augmenting their power. Later in his life, free trade became a major issue in federal politics, and his book Protection or Free Trade was read into the congressional record by 5 Democratic congressmen. Spencer McCallum wrote that Henry George was undeniably the greatest writer and orator on free trade who ever lived. Tyler Cowen wrote that George's 1886 book, Protection or Free Trade, remains perhaps the best argued tract on free trade to this day. Secret ballot. George was one of the earliest, strongest and most prominent advocates for adoption of the secret ballot in the United States. Harvard historian Jill Lepore asserts that Henry George's advocacy is the reason Americans vote with secret ballots today. George's first article in support of the secret ballot was entitled Bribery in Elections, and published in the Overland Review of December 1871. His second article was Money in Elections, published in the North American Review of March 1883. The first state to adopt the secret ballot, also called the Australian ballot, was Massachusetts in 1888 under the leadership of Richard Henry Dana III. By 1891, more than half the states had adopted it, too. Money creation, banking, and national deficit reform. George supported the use of debt-free currency, such as the greenback, which governments would spend into circulation to help finance public spending through the capture of seigniorage rents. He opposed the use of metallic currency and fiat money issued by private commercial banks. Citizens' dividend and universal pension. George proposed to create a pension and disability system, and an unconditional basic income from surplus land rents. It would be distributed to residents as a right, instead of as charity. Georgists often refer to this policy as a citizen's dividend in reference to a similar proposal by Thomas Paine. Bankruptcy protection and an abolition of debtors' prisons. George noted that most debt, though bearing the appearance of genuine capital interest, was not issued for the purpose of creating true capital, but instead as an obligation against rental flows from existing economic privilege. George therefore reasoned that the state should not provide aid to creditors in the form of sheriffs, constables, courts, and prisons to enforce collection on these illegitimate obligations. Modern economists have noted that even in today's developed economies, a majority of credit is issued to purchase claims on future land rents rather than to finance the creation of capital. Michael Hudson and Adair Turner say that about 80% of credit finances real estate purchases, mostly land. George acknowledged that this policy would limit the banking system but believed that would actually be an economic boon, since the financial sector, in its existing form, was mostly augmenting rent extraction, as opposed to productive investment. The curse of credit, George wrote, was that it expands when there is a tendency to speculation, and sharply contracts just when most needed to assure confidence and prevent industrial waste. George even said that a debt jubilee could remove the accumulation of burdensome obligations without reducing aggregate wealth. Other proposals. Henry George also proposed the following reforms: to dramatically reduce the size of the military, to replace contract patronage with the direct employment of government workers, with civil service protections, to build and maintain free mass transportation and libraries, to extend suffrage to women, and even to have one House of Congress entirely male and the other entirely female, to implement campaign finance reform and political spending restrictions.